Okay, oh, the bright lights. Well, good evening, and welcome to the first SAMA event for Contemporary Art Month 2009. I'm David Rubin, the Brown Foundation Curator of Contemporary Art here at SAMA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation with our guest, Marilyn Lanfear. But before we begin, please be sure and turn off your cell phones. Also, I want to remind you we have two more contemporary art events coming up at SAMA this month. On July 21st, Tuesday, 2 weeks from tonight. I think I'm getting a little echo there. 2 weeks from tonight, on July 21st, I'll be doing a conversation with Franco Mondini Ruiz. And if you haven't explored the second floor, every year at this time we rotate a few objects in the collection and put up some new acquisitions, and we recently acquired a sculpture by Franco, so be sure to check that out tonight, and some of the new things you haven't seen before and some things that have returned from storage. And then on July 31st, we will be presenting our SAMA Soiree, which is a party, an evening of fun events on the river here, on the river landing and in the museum. And that's July 31st, and the theme is post-modern. I'm told it's a 1980s clothing theme. So if you have 80s clothing in your closet, be sure and wear it. Also, don't forget, we have three wonderful contemporary exhibitions currently on view. So at Contemporary Art Month, SAMA is very up to the moment. We have the exhibition Water Flow in the Focus Gallery, and in the Cowden Gallery, of course, Ry Cooder, Vincent Valdez, El Chavez Ravine, and John Hernandez, Zoe's Room. Those exhibitions are up through August 2nd. Water Flow is up through August 23rd. So if you haven't gotten to them yet, be sure and take the opportunity to do so. Okay, it's now my pleasure to shift focus to Marilyn Lanfear. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
You've made so many remarkable contributions to the San Antonio art community, and tonight we're going to find out more about that. So let's begin, Marilyn. You were born in Waco, Texas.
Yes.
And you grew up in Corpus Christi. Tell me about high school. You had a particular distinction there?
Oh, yes, but I'm too modest.
Okay, then all right. Well, Marilyn Lanfear, not only was she valedictorian of her high school class, but she went on to attend Del Mar College, where she was valedictorian as well. After there, she studied at UT Austin, and then you married.
I married. It took me about 20 years to get my BFA.
You had a detour.
I had a detour, yeah.
So you married, and you were a military wife?
No.
No.
Well, yes, for a while, but just a short while.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the Army on your credentials, so I wanted to kind of get some sense of what that was about.
No, I don't really have any Army credentials.
Okay, and then the mother of 4 children, right?
Yes.
And,
yes.
And some grandchildren as well?
Well, one is right here. And
welcome.
Several grandchildren.
Several grandchildren in the audience tonight. That's terrific. Okay, now you moved to San Antonio in 1958, and
I think so.
Then you did your duty as a wife and mother, and then in 1976, several years later, you decided to go back to school.
As soon as UTSA opened up, I went back to school.
Okay, so you were just waiting for them.
Right. Right.
And then you got 2 degrees there, right?
Right.
Your BFA and your MFA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Marilyn has been actively exhibiting her artwork since the 1980s, and she actually was a participant in the SAMA time capsule that was organized by Jean Elder, who I know is here in our audience tonight. And yes. And her work is not only in SAMA's collection, but in the collections of other museums in our area and elsewhere, including the McNay Art Museum, the Museum of South Texas in Corpus Christi, the El Paso Museum of Art, and the University of Colorado at Boulder. So, the image you see on the screen, of course, is the work in SAMA's collection. We'll get to that, but before we do, let's go back and look at some of your earliest artwork, Marilyn, and see what you can tell us. Okay, the remote control isn't isn't remoting.
Do you think that's...
I don't know, but I'll do it this way.
Okay. I thought maybe it was because I spilled my water
This
down
isn't.
there.
This isn't.
Probably
Here we
not.
go. Okay. All right. So this is work from the late 1970s.
Well, these particular drawings are from my going to the Mexican dance class every week for weeks and weeks. I spent a lot of time looking at things and drawing things at that time.
And what are these specific subjects we're looking at?
They're students at the Mexican dance classes.
Okay, now it's working. The work on the left, that's one of your early paintings.
It's an oil painting. I make a lot of surrogate portraits of particular people, and many are in the form of domestic items. This chair or the tabletop were preparations for that. The other is a painting in gouache of my...
Your mic's doing funny things.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so you were telling us that the furniture and the domestic items, actually they were associated with specific people?
Well, they were, I guess, associated with me at this time and with my environs, but later I think that it did me in good stead to pay that close attention to how things looked and how to replicate them.
In terms of looking at your sort of domestic environment for your subject matter, were you already involved in the women's movement at that time? Since I know a lot of women artists were dealing with similar subject matter, particularly wallpaper patterning and things of that sort.
Well, I was. We didn't have a women's caucus here in town, so I belonged to the one in Houston, which meant I went every once in a while. And I was drawing and painting these domestic things because they were there, not because I was influenced by the women's movement. It just so happened that I and the women did the same thing. I wasn't, later I was more involved with
and we'll see examples of how that shows up in your work.
But not at that time.
Not yet, okay.
I spent a lot of time making watercolors when my children were young because that's a pretty safe thing to do. You can put it away quickly. And I went out every week with Caroline Shelton. I guess a lot of you know her. And some other women. And we painted.
It was like a group watercolor?
Yeah. And I think...
Did you paint out of doors? Was this
out of doors,
plein air?
yeah. And with watercolor, that was Caroline's specialty. And but I think the best part about that was listening to Caroline's stories. And I would say that she was a big influence on me. And maybe one of the reasons I'm telling stories today.
What was the nature of her stories?
Oh, you name it. And I remember at the time the McCarthy hearings were going on, and she was sometimes late meeting us because she couldn't leave the television. And
you're talking about in the 1950s?
In the 1950s? Well, no, 60s, I guess.
McCarthy was the 50s.
Well, there was something going on, and
the anti-war movement, Watergate in the 70s.
Watergate, whatever. She would give us a blow-by-blow of what she had heard on television, and it was, I wish we had recorded it. It was so funny. It was really, really funny.
So what's the scene we're looking at in this watercolor?
Oh, this is somewhere downtown at a place where you eat, and they have umbrellas.
So it's no, but it's interesting because San Antonio is today such a colorful city, and it appears it was back then.
Oh, it was. Yes, it was. It was. Okay, when I went back to school, I really majored in printmaking. So these are lithographs and intaglio. I actually invented those counting beads. I invented that method of drawing on a stone. And I was encouraged to write about it and be put in the books, and I never got around to it. Now, of course, I would do that.
Could you tell us more about the method you're talking about?
Well, I covered the stone with just black ink or tush, and then I removed some of the color with acid. So I painted in a kind of backwards way. And that's not unusual, I think, but the way I was able to preserve that and print it, and I could do an edition of 20 or 30, and it would hold up. Usually when you remove the color with acid, it doesn't hold up while you print. But I didn't write that up. Now I've forgotten how to do it. This is tush. That's the ink that you would put on a lithographic stone, and I did a lot of painting with that. This is from a series of about Mona, who was my mother-in-law.
And actually, a lot of your imagery over the years has dealt with family members.
Family members, yes, and things at home. And I don't think that had anything to do with the women's movement, because I was pretty remote from it. Later, I can.
Well, when you got to New York.
Yeah, when I got to New York, and I and knew a lot of the women who were involved, and I could recite the history, but I wasn't aware of it. Here in San Antonio, I don't think anybody was. I can be corrected on that, but I mean, it was just so far away. It was in California, and it was in New York, but well, Houston sort of, and but now these are some more prints.
And you've got some unusual materials, don't you?
Yeah, I did a whole series of prints where actually I inked up a rectangle this way, and I sealed something between the rag paper, say, and silk or Japanese paper. I sealed something the way you might take your special picture of your mother or something and seal it between two pieces.
Okay.
To preserve it. And this, I did a big series here that had to do with my mother's illness, her last illness. And but there were sort of veiled content there. And now, of course, I'm more forthcoming, and I just say what I want to say. But then couldn't say it. I don't know. They're very abstract. But I think someone saw a whole group of these in an exhibition and came out and said, you know, I feel like I've been in the hospital. So they did sort of understand. About that time, I was invited to be in an exhibition called The Artist and the Quilt, where I think 25 artists were asked to design a quilt. And I should have brought a pillow. This chair is too big for me.
I think when you lean forward is when we get the feedback on the mic. So
okay.
Try not to lean forward too much, if you can.
Okay.
When you sit back comfortably and your mic won't.
I can't sit back comfortably because then my feet don't reach the floor.
Well,
I'll sit still.
Okay.
Straight
it's
up.
just I've noticed when you lean forward, we get feedback on your mic.
Oh, okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. About 15, 20, so many artists were asked to design a quilt and to work with a quilt maker and design a quilt that was for the museum at that day. Well, not necessarily for the McNay. It turned out to be for the McNay, but at that time, quilts were not art. Quilts were quilts, and art was art. And so I think this was the first big group of quilts that were displayed in the museum and called art. And I had been making those prints, monoprints, that had to do with my mother's illness. And so you see the way this looks, that it was very related to what I was doing at that time. This, however, is, now here's before I came right out and said things that I wanted. This was indicating something. This is a biographical quilt. It's called A Quilt is a Cover. That has double meaning too. It's in two parts. One's a little bigger than the other, and there are 4 borders around it, white on white. The outer border was a traditional pattern called the courthouse steps, because my husband at that time was a lawyer, and mine started out exactly like his. His stayed the very same all the way around, and mine went through drunkard's path. That's not literal, and came into a very free-form pattern at the end and much larger than it was. Then there are 4 borders in the middle, and they each represent one of my children. And whatever they were doing. The one closest inside, you can't see the detail, I'm sure, but is baseballs and baseball bats. And my son, that son, Daniel, was in junior high, I guess, and he was and has been quite a baseball player. And we said, Dan, do you want to design your own border? And he said, sure, and it took him about 10 minutes. Went upstairs, and that was baseballs and baseball bats, which makes a really nice border. My daughter, Teresa Helms, was my quilter. She was not a quilter, actually. She designs children's clothes. But she learned to quilt, and I learned to quilt, and we were the quilters on this.
Had you ever quilted before?
No, nor since. But I have some. It takes a lot of time to quilt.
But you've done a lot of application of buttons.
Right, and I'm not lazy. But I have several other quilts I would make if Teresa would volunteer again to be the quilter.
Well, maybe there's a show in that.
Yeah, but this is, it's in 2 halves, and it can be buttoned together with about 1,000 little buttons, little covered buttons like the ones on your wedding dress. And if you start on the outside and you match up, you get to that middle section and it doesn't match up. If you start in the middle section and button outward, that doesn't match up. So I never could get everything together, just the way it should be. And of course, you can unbutton it and you can take your half, which is what I've done now. I took my half of it, and Gene had his. But no, actually,
well, you reminded me there was an very important performance artwork called Flux Divorce by the performance artist Jeffrey Hendricks. When he and his wife split up, they actually cut the bed in half, and each took part.
Oh, each took, yeah. No, this actually is in the Altria collection, but that was the whole idea. You could take your part. And I think titles have always been important to me, and I really realized at this time. This is called A Quilt is a Cover, and symbolic meaning is very important to me. And also, it's important to me that the non-art audience is involved, becomes involved in my work. And I've been sewing ever since. So this was a really watershed moment for me.
And then you started to veer into the arena of performance art.
Well, I did a lot of performance, but it's not necessarily performance on a stage in front of an audience, but things that are a little more private, and on the other hand, they might involve other people more. And I was doing a lot of photography work. So this figure is about twice as tall as I am, and I put it into the woods and did a series of photographs so that the figure could move.
And who is the figure?
The figure is myself,
okay.
me.
So it's a self-portrait?
Yeah, Yeah, I had several of those. And I was going to throw this away when I moved one time, and somehow I just couldn't throw myself on the garbage. So I folded it up and I kept it, and I'm glad I did now. So I had it photographed recently. I had several figures. I don't know where the others are. I guess in the garbage. I don't know. And then I did a number of performances, again, that are kind of private. Larry McIntyre did the photographs on this, and I dressed and with the makeup and the hairdo and so forth of the 1930s, and the costumes. I've always liked costumes.
And where did this take place, and what did you actually do for your performance?
I went to these places and had my picture made and then put them together in a book. This was made in the Sign of the Flying Red Horse restroom there, which is really an interesting place. On the corner of Austin Highway, where that was the new Austin Highway, started in 1930, I think. They had a big celebration on the street, and this restroom has a little sitting room, and it has tiles. I'm sure, it has tiles, right? Yeah. And
now, had you studied any contemporary photography at UTSA? Were you familiar with some of the performative photography by artists like Dwayne Michaels or Cindy Sherman?
Sort of. I took a couple of photography classes, but if I had built myself a darkroom at that time, I would have really stayed with it. But because